All right. Hopefully this is working. Had a little issue getting in today. So if y'all were waiting, thank you. Thank you for waiting. Okay. I was going to try another platform to try to cut back on some of the popping that happens with YouTube Live, but that might just be for another day. And hope y'all are here for to share or not to share. So, talking about self disclosure best practices for those of us who are mental health clinicians. Make sure y'all can hear me. Okay. All right. Got a couple of thumbs up. So, I'm going to assume that means that you can hear me okay. Again, just talking about self disclosure today as far as some considerations we have for mental health clinicians. And I was looking up, first of all, what is self disclosure? And I found that there are a lot of different definitions for how we describe or even just define self disclosure. And I found one that I felt like fit best for what I feel we do as mental health clinicians. It was noted as an internal process, it's sharing personal information, thoughts, and feelings with others. It was noted in the definition that it can be verbal, it can be nonverbal. So we'll talk about some options that are verbal and some that are nonverbal. And really, self disclosure, I did not know this, but it was introduced by a psychologist, Sidney Gerard, in 1964. They put out a book, The Transparent Self, Self Disclosure and Well Being. And that's when the discussion around self disclosure, at least in research, really got started. Before that, Freud was, and we all know from some of our some of our coursework, right, that Freud basically was against self-disclosure. Freud recommended that we withhold information about ourselves, and I found a really interesting quote. So this was in like the early 1900s, I think, when Freud was writing about this. But the quote was that we as mental health clinicians should be impenetrable to the patient, that we should reflect nothing but what is shown. And essentially, Freud's concern was that if we started using self disclosure with our clients, it could complicate things with the client as far as any transference or resistance that might come up. Freud also noted that it was a hazard in the process of interpretation. So clients could become super curious and the focus could turn to the therapist instead of themselves. So that was Freud's main concern. And I don't think that those concerns aren't valid, right? Like those are very valid questions or very valid concerns. But the question is, if we're going to use it because some of it is automatic, if you will, we'll talk about that. Then how do we make sure that it best meets the needs of the clients as well as maybe doesn't extend beyond any boundaries that we feel like we have? I found an interesting article from 2015 that really went into the different types of self disclosure based on therapeutic or theory. And if we're looking at humanistic or Rogerians, they really recommended that us as therapists would share any relevant feelings that we were having in sessions with clients. They noted that this would model openness, strength, and vulnerability. It would invite a deeper level of client disclosure. And the hope was through this disclosure, it would increase levels of trust, perceived similarity, credibility. This is something that I saw come up a lot when therapists were talking about using self disclosure, that sometimes self disclosure for them would contribute to their credibility with the client. And then, of course, the empathic understanding. So, an example that I kind of found of this type of disclosure is if we're in a session with the client and maybe emotions are running kind of high, and we say something to the effect of like, I'm feeling overwhelmed just hearing you talk about that. We're letting them know kind of what our emotions or experiences are during that session as the client is also talking. Then the next one is psychodynamic. And they noted that this would be a tool to enhance a process of mirroring the client as well as further the connection that we had in the therapist client relationship, which also came up a lot in the research as far as why therapists said they use self disclosure was to enhance the connection and improve that therapeutic alliance that we have with clients. An example of this that I could think of is if as a therapist we would show maybe some surprise facial expressions. I've had this happen where I've actually been surprised and it's come out on my face, and I've had people say like, "Yeah, that's exactly how I felt." Whatever I had on my face, they were saying, "Yes, that's exactly how I felt when this happened," or whatever. The third version of this, if you will, from feminist and multicultural perspectives, it was pretty key for both of these approaches to therapy that you would use self disclosure. They first note that this is a tool to promote equality in therapy. And this was also recommended when the client initiated the therapist self disclosure. So the client was maybe asking a question or making some sort of statement where they wanted to know more about the therapist or the therapist experience. It wasn't like the therapist just responding to something, it was actually a client asking a therapist and then they would respond. They noted that this would signal for the therapist that they're treating a client as a person, like an actual human being, and not just another number or just another client. Sometimes they noted that the clients in the research would judge the therapist and judge using the process of self disclosure to help establish rapport with the therapist. So, not only are we from the therapist perspective saying, hey, this can help build our rapport, clients are also engaging and asking us to disclose information so that they can increase the rapport that they feel. One of the keys that I thought was interesting about this particular wave of self disclosure, if you will, is it was recommended we as therapists don't hesitate in answering questions or sharing information, that we go ahead and answer the question at hand, because this would then help the client to trust us and it could bring our rapport to another level. So it's kind of building upon already self disclosure is helpful, especially for responding to a client request for self disclosure, but then also just the way we respond. So, by not being hesitant, by being open, it is going to help increase the trust the client has with us and therefore increase our rapport as well. It was found that when therapists would get defensive or if they declined to answer a question, the client also shut down on self-disclosure. So the more the therapist was willing to be open and vulnerable, the more the client was willing to be open and vulnerable, and then vice versa, exactly the same. So if the therapist pushed back on that request, then the client might share less information or just be less responsive as far as improvement to the therapy. There were some participants in this research who noted that they would test the therapist by asking personal questions to see whether or not they could trust them based on how they responded to their questions. There's lots of benefits of self disclosure that was in this one particular article, but I matched it up against other articles with self disclosure, and this is kind of the summary that I got. Self disclosure from us helps to increase clients' perceptions of our warmth, how we're showing up to sessions. It increased the client's liking of the therapist. They noted moderate numbers of therapist self disclosure led to increase in client self disclosure. There's that balance again, right? Like, what is too much? What is too little? They're kind of saying moderate numbers. So, based on this entire study and all these participants, moderate numbers that fell in the middle would increase client self disclosure. Disclosures that conveyed thoughts and feelings related to the therapist in session and their experiences led to more favorable effects than disclosures of the therapist outside of session, so about their personal lives. And that comes back to that example that I shared earlier, as far as I'm hearing you talk about this, I'm getting really overwhelmed, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I feel overwhelmed. I imagine you felt overwhelmed. It was about the session itself and about the content of the session versus about their personal life. Like, after this, I have my own doctor's appointment, or any number of things that you could think maybe weren't relevant to the content being shared. This did lead to favorable effects. So therapist expertness, trustworthiness, and attractiveness, all of those were found from those in therapy session disclosures. Yeah, can you define moderate? So a few shared facts of what we have in common or something else. I think what they meant by moderate was literally the number of disclosures that happened. So rather than like it being a full story or just an anecdote, it was more about how many happened over the course of those sessions or over the course of that therapeutic relationship. Um, some of this is going to depend upon the clients that we have. It's going to depend upon us and how comfortable we are sharing. But I think finding that balance between, if we're not sharing at all, we're sharing very little, then we might not achieve that level of trust and approachability. But if we're sharing too much and maybe the client is starting to shut down, then we can kind of figure out what are the edges of that moderate amount. Um, I don't know that there's like a specific number like 5 times or, 1 time every session or anything like that, but I think it's about the rapport that you built up with the client and kind of knowing when to share and when not to share, if that makes sense. Which I have some best practices that will hopefully will help guide you as you do that going forward. But yeah, I think moderate for what they're saying, it was across the board for all the therapists, those who fell in the middle. But we're going to have to figure that out just based on what we're picking up from clients. Um, is it not enough? Are we being defensive? And speaking of being defensive, I always think about what many of us are told, as far as if a client asks us a question like, what's your age? Or do you have a family? That we would immediately say, like, well, tell me why that's important for you to know. And I think that can come across as defensive. Like, answering a question with a question and we're not really addressing what was asked. I think that's what can come of that defensiveness. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll talk some more. Like, I've got those best practices. We can talk about how you can figure out and stay self-aware of like when is it helpful and when is it not helpful. Disclosures that therapists gave that were humanizing, so essentially making the therapist look like a human, which we are, we're not machines. It helped more so in decreasing those acute symptoms that clients had. Humanizing of the therapist also helped with fewer interpersonal problems towards the termination of that client's work with the therapist. So, in the very beginning, the humanizing aspects help to decrease the acute symptoms. And then in the long run, that humanizing self disclosure actually helped with them outside of therapy and their interpersonal problems they might have been having. Humanizing disclosures, again, convey that we are human beings. We have a life outside of sessions. It might not necessarily directly relate to the client's issue, but it shows us as humans. I think for me, sometimes it could just be like, sorry, I was running late. An example that happened, like I got locked out of my house and I'm trying to get to a virtual session. And so when I'm late, I'm popping in, I'm like, hey, I'm so sorry, I got locked out of my house. Right. I think that's a pretty humanizing example that a lot of us can relate to, unfortunately. Some of the examples they found in the research, when a therapist would note that maybe they had been ill recently or that they were hungry, something just as simple as that. Maybe sharing a description of a prior job that the therapist had had, indicating like dietary, holiday, or entertainment preferences. And entertainment preferences often come up in therapy that I do. I'm thinking from forever, I've talked to folks about TV shows and games. What books are you reading? What movies have you seen? I think that's a really humanizing approach. Also, and I'm probably not as good about this, was awareness of popular culture trends, that actually helped to humanize those therapists. And it gave some space for both the therapist and the client to step outside of the therapeutic dialogue. They also looked at disclosures that conveyed a similarity between the client and the therapist. These also were associated with fewer acute symptoms and interpersonal problems. So the humanizing disclosures, and now this one is showing some sort of similarity between the client and therapist, decrease acute symptoms, decrease interpersonal problems. They did look at neutral emotion self disclosures, so reflecting the therapist's experience in the moment. That was related to fewer acute symptoms and interpersonal problems as well. The neutral and positive disclosures were associated with fewer interpersonal problems at in the long term. Um, so positive would be like an event or experience that the therapist had that brought them maybe pride or satisfaction. Negative was shame, and that they didn't show, at least statistically anyway, that there was any improvement in the symptoms or interpersonal problems based on negative disclosures like shame. Is how they describe that. So there are lots of benefits to disclosure. There are many different types of disclosure. But I think what's really key for us in everything that we do is thinking about ethics. Like, how does that come into play with self disclosure? How do we think through this and use our codes? Actually, I went through the MBCC Code of Ethics, the AAMFT Code of Ethics, and the ACA Code of Ethics. And none of them really talk about self disclosure and the therapist. It's not directly like that phrase, self disclosure, is not in those codes of ethics, except for the ACA, which I will talk about that phrase. But in the rest of the codes, nothing about self disclosure was in there. If you go search disclosure, you'll find a lot, but what they're actually talking about is disclosing information like to third parties. So getting a release of information to share client information, maybe having a minor client and sharing with the parents or legal guardians, things like that. That's what they were talking about when they used disclosure. So self disclosure, that full phrase, was only mentioned in the ACA Code of Ethics once, and it was under F8A student welfare. And essentially, they were saying that for faculty who are teaching counselors in training, they need to let students know what the expectations are around students' self disclosure during the training process. So it wasn't about therapist self-disclosure or even necessarily the student self-disclosure with clients. This was about how self-disclosure might be used within the curriculum. I thought that was really interesting. I've been adjunct faculty in a few different programs, and I've seen the different ways that self-disclosure either is or is not incorporated. So for some programs in like the skills training or pre-prac, depending upon what your program called it, some of them would have you make up a fake client to then do those test like practice sessions. But there were other programs who would have you speak as yourself, speak about an experience you had as long as it fit within certain parameters. So to me, I think self-disclosure in that regard, students should know that that's an expectation in that skill practice class. Some of the other courses I'm thinking about that might bring up self-disclosure are especially related to group therapy or group sessions. where again, if you're showing up as yourself in this group session, then there might be a level of expectation that you as a student would have some self disclosure in that setting. So yeah, interesting that it's not directly noted in any of the codes of ethics as far as like therapist self-disclosure, but it is noted for students just once in the ACA. So a few of the areas that you could look at as far as what the code of ethics are talking about or could be related to with self-disclosure. One is B1, respecting client rights. B1A, multicultural diversity considerations in the ACA Code of Ethics. So it says counselors maintain awareness and sensitivity regarding cultural meanings of confidentiality and privacy. And then this next statement, counselors respect differing views towards disclosure of information. So for me, I'm reading this as they're saying we're respecting clients' desire or the extent to which they will disclose to us, or maybe are okay with us disclosing information somewhere else. But I think it can be applied the other way too, that we would respect the client's views of how much we disclose as well. And I'll talk about some best practices on how to figure that out. How do you know if you don't ask, right? So we'll talk about how to get some more information from clients about what level of disclosure do they expect from us. There's an article from the ACA, their Counseling Today magazine. You can find this online. I'm an ACA member, so I know I have access to it, but I'm pretty sure you can also get access to it. It's called Counselor Self-Disclosure, Encouragement or Impediment to Client Growth. And at the very end of the article, they list out some of the ACA codes of ethics that they would recommend looking at and considering regarding self disclosure. But they don't say what each of those codes is actually telling us. So I've done my very best to pull that together. I've read through the different codes. I've looked at in what ways could they be interpreted. So hopefully this is helpful if you are thinking about using self disclosure, or if you already have and are considering whether or not it went well regarding ethics, then maybe this will be helpful. But know that this is not, perfect by any means. This is just Dana's opinion and Dana's interpretation of this. So A1A, primary responsibility, is noting that we respect the dignity and promote the welfare of clients. They really are our primary responsibility when we are deciding whether or not to disclose. Is this going to help the client? Is this going to, as it says, promote the welfare of the client if we use self disclosure? A4A, avoiding harm. So we would avoid harm and minimize or remedy unavoidable harm or unanticipated harm. And I think that maybe that last bit is what could really apply to counselor self disclosure. If we're using self disclosure and it does harm the client, then we need to address that. If we can at all before we self disclose, avoid harm and minimize harm within that self disclosure. But sometimes it's unavoidable. There's some unintentional harm that happens. So now, how do we address it with clients? How do we help to remedy that? A4B is around our personal values. And if you're looking for an article specific to that, there's another article in Counseling Today called How Counselors in Training Can Navigate Value Disclosures. Our values are very personal to us. So if we're sharing those values, whether it, even if it is a shared value with a client, if we are telling them what our values are, that is a self disclosure. So the Code of Ethics notes that we are aware of and avoid imposing our values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors onto the client. Also, that we'd seek training when we're at risk of imposing values onto the client and develop self awareness regarding sharing of values. That comes back to being able to track during a session, like how is a client responding? Have they opened up more? Have they shut down perhaps? That's going to be some self awareness. Figuring out in the moment, are we comfortable with sharing that? Does it feel appropriate? One of the things they recommend in the article is use intention when disclosing. So we're looking at that beneficence within our code of ethics. We want to do best by the individual who's in front of us, the client, as well as the society in general. So, how are we being intentional about sharing our values that we have with clients, whether they match or not? They also note that we could recognize, quote, activation points. So use grounding techniques during times where maybe we've given unintended disclosures, maybe we felt really overwhelmed by a request for a disclosure. How can we start to recognize when that is happening, as well as what techniques can we use to manage that actually during a session? And then, of course, embracing diversity regarding values. They note in the article that we can identify areas of specialization, which many of us do, especially once we're a couple of years into our license, or maybe we've got some certain experiences at different sites that have shaped our specialization. And while we are specialized, that we are also being receptive to a diverse value systems. That everyone's going to have a different value system, even if it feels like these two people are super similar, or you and I, client and therapist, are super similar. It doesn't mean that we won't have different value systems. A6B is around extending counseling boundaries. So, with regards to this, we consider risks and benefits when we're sharing about ourselves, and that we take appropriate precautions. And you'll hear this throughout, monitoring ourselves, but also getting input from others. So, getting input from the client, of course, getting input from supervisors, from colleagues, whatever that looks like, so you can get feedback on how you're using self-disclosure, whether or not it's going well, or how you want to approach self-disclosure moving forward. They also mention informed consent in here. So I'm thinking informed consent related to self-disclosure, we could ask like, "Hey, I've actually had something similar happen to me. Are you okay if I share that?" So asking if we can share it. You could also note like, if it would be helpful, I've got some insights into that I could share. And so you're asking on the front end again, like, would this be helpful for me to share some insights? And then also saying to the client, like, let me know if this isn't helpful, whether that's before the disclosure or after the disclosure happens, asking for that feedback from the client, of giving them the space to let you know that this self disclosure was not helpful. Get the consultation, get supervision, and document everything. So, document any of the self disclosures you might use in session, document any ethical decision making that you use to get to the point of disclosing. So, some of the best practices, it was mixed. Some people said these should be spontaneous and in the moment, and other people said that they would take days to decide, or weeks, I guess, if you're only meeting weekly, to decide whether or not they should disclose something to a client. So, document that whole process, document the client's reaction to the self disclosure, and how that might have changed your dynamic and maybe the therapy as a whole and their progress. C2G, impairment. So, monitoring yourself for impairment, and again, seeking assistance when you are impaired or when you're concerned about being impaired. H6 is social media. And I think some of this can be unintentional self disclosure on social media, depending upon what sort of privacy we have set on any of our number of profiles. But any of them could be viewed potentially. I'm just thinking some of them, like Pinterest, if you have a Pinterest board and you haven't made that private, it's very possible that they could find that. If you have a LinkedIn because you're connecting with other professionals, they could find that too. This isn't social media, but I will talk about it. Our directories, where we put ourselves out there, our website, any bios that we share, that also is going to be some possibly unintentional, but it's going to be intentional disclosure as well. So social media, and then I put here, etc., because I think it goes beyond just social media. There's so many areas online where our information could be shared. I1B ethical decision making. So use and document your ethical decision making, especially if you are aligning it with a particular model. You might not have time to really go through your whole process in a session. You're not maybe you can sit there for a few moments and think, of course, but you're probably not going to want to leave the client hanging for like 5 or 10 minutes while you decide if this is an appropriate self-disclosure or if you should maybe call a colleague and check in with them, right? You're probably not going to have time to go through the full ethical decision-making process. Um, you could consider maybe some shorthand, and those will come up in the best practices that I have. Just some questions that you routinely ask yourself when you feel like now's a good time to use self disclosure. Have some check in questions for yourself to determine like who's benefiting from this. I think that's really important. So, self disclosure, another definition here. Self-disclosure starts happening the moment that we start interacting with clients, but I would also argue that it happens even sooner than that when they're searching for us online, they're searching for a therapist, they find us in a directory, they're looking at our websites. Anywhere that they find us before they talk to us is going to start that self-disclosure process. There are plenty of nonverbal communication or approaches to self disclosure, like what clothes are we wearing? How is our office decorated? You can see, well, I've got the trees back there, but then I also have like the trans flag. So the way that we decorate our office, that's already giving some sort of disclosure to the client about maybe who we are and our approach. But I think our bios are one that's really key for sharing about us, things that they might not otherwise know. I've seen plenty of therapist bios online that talk about their families, that talk about what they like to do outside of session. So if a client is reading that, they've already got some insight into their therapist or potential therapist. Also in our intake paperwork, and some of this is required disclosure, self-disclosure in our intake paperwork. I'm thinking about in my state with our professional disclosure statements, we have to talk about what our experience in therapy thus far has been. Where was our training done? What sort of licenses or certifications do we have? What experience do we have? How long have we been working in the field? So, all of that, while in line with our professional disclosures, it is self disclosure as well. And I think that our especially the more control we have over the practices that we're working with, as far as our informed consent with the client, like your policies, your procedures, things like that, the more control you have over it, the more disclosure you're giving to the client saying, like, I've got control over these practices. This is what I decided would be best for me and clients. So that's also letting them know a bit about yourself as well. So, how do you find out from clients if self disclosure is going to be helpful? I think you can ask that in their intake paperwork as well as in that first session. Ask them about their prior therapy experiences. Ask them what has worked well with therapists before, what's not worked well, because they may say that they've had prior therapists who shared too much and that didn't work for them. Or maybe they've said that therapists didn't share enough, that they asked questions, but the therapist became defensive. So now you've got some insight into what went well, what didn't go well. Um, and then for clients who haven't had therapy before, just asking them about what they expect of therapy. What do they think will happen? What do they think sessions will look like? How do they think the interaction will go? So you can again get an idea of what their expectations around self-disclosure are. After you use self-disclosure, whether it's intentional, unintentional, maybe it just happens in the moment, or maybe you've been thinking about it for a while, I think following that up with the reason why you're sharing that self disclosure can help us as therapists be held responsible for clarity around the intention behind using that self disclosure. That's going to be helpful, especially for clients who've never been to therapy before. It's about why am I using self disclosure? They can understand what's going on, why we're using this approach. It also makes the purpose or intention clear to the client. We're making sure there's no assumptions being made. We're not assuming that the client knows why we shared that. They're not assuming why we shared it and maybe taking it in a different direction. There's that potential to guard against any negative effects that could happen with that disclosure by telling them why you did that. If you take nothing else away from today, I think this is my opinion of best practice related to self disclosure. And then I'll talk about more best practices. But I wanted to start with what I think is the best practice we can use with self disclosure. Like anything else that we use in therapy, it's only going to be as useful as the client and how they use it, what their response to it is. It's only helpful when it's being therapeutic for the client. So, how do you keep the focus on the client after the disclosure is made? You can ask the client directly in how they're responding to the disclosure information. So, one example is, how helpful was that to hear? How helpful was that for me to share with you? You could also end the disclosure with an empathy statement. So, yeah, I experienced this or I did this, but it sounds like you are experiencing X, Y, or Z. And I think that can be really helpful when you're sharing like a frustrating moment, for example. Like, I was really frustrated about this particular thing not being in stock, but it sounds like you are also frustrated, and the client can maybe correct you when you end it with, sounds like you are feeling this or you experience this, whatever that looks like, you're pulling it back to them, and they have the option to tell you whether or not that's correct. You can also ask them how they experience whatever the topic is. So maybe you're talking about anxiety, and for you, you're describing some recent anxiety that you had, and then you describe what it's like for you in your body to have anxiety, because maybe the client's having a difficult time recognizing bodily sensations with anxiety. So you share what it's like for you. And then after that, you turn it back to them and say, okay, is that something that you've experienced? Or where do you feel anxiety in your body? So always turning it back to the client, always giving some sort of question or prompt that they can respond to, or at the very least, correct us if it wasn't helpful. And speaking of this, I think regular check ins with a client is really, really helpful, regardless of if you're using self disclosure or not, because it allows us to recognize potential ruptures and address them sooner than maybe we would have if we hadn't asked. So during a session, let's say you realize you're talking on and on about yourself and the client's starting to tune out. You could just acknowledge, like, hey, I realize I'm talking too much. I'm going to turn the session back over to you. At the end of every session, and clients know this ahead of time, this is one of the things we talk about in our first session or even the consultation that we had before. I always ask, what would have made this session better? So it gives them an opportunity, if they have any feedback, to share with me what would have made it better. And hopefully, if I had shared something with them that wasn't helpful, they could say, like, that self-disclosure wasn't helpful, or I wish you would share less about yourself, maybe. Not had that happen, but it's possible, right? Like, that it may not be a good fit for me to continue sharing about myself if they're not actually finding it helpful. And you can also give them follow-up forms. So when I have students at my practice, they will every so often give a client a form to fill out about how a session went, how the therapy overall is going. And you can do the same. If you have a hard time coming up with questions, you could use a form. There are plenty of those online, but you could also send it to the client after, have them fill it out, and send it back to you. Some of the key points from that ACA Counseling Today article that I mentioned, they said use self disclosure sparingly, professionally, and appropriately. The key in using self disclosure is to learn how, when, and whether or not to use the self disclosure. And the only way to do that is through training, experience, and supervision. Just figuring out for each client what makes sense, figuring out for you on the whole what makes sense, and your approach to therapy, is self disclosure a part of it or not? But just be prepared that if you do use self disclosure, clients may have follow up questions. We're all, as human beings, generally pretty curious. So they may have additional questions for you. And one of the recommendations in the article was to know ahead of time where your bailout point is. So, at what point are those questions going to become too maybe intrusive, too personal, maybe asking about information you don't feel prepared or ready to share? Kind of know what that is. What is your boundary around how much do you share? Appropriate self disclosure is client focused, validates their experience, and helps to continue exploration of whatever the topics are. I think that's summing up a lot of what I've already said, but that really is the key to self disclosure because we're using it as a therapeutic tool. The hope then is it's going to help our therapy, help our client, and help their progress. They noted that constructive self disclosure is brief, focused on meaning, and light on story. And I know that I can sometimes get in the weeds about details of a story. So I try to listen to myself as I'm disclosing information to find out, like, okay, where have I maybe veered into a different topic, or where's the client starting to tune out? Just making sure that I'm not going too deep into whatever the story is I'm sharing, trying to keep it really like surface level and brief, and focus on what we're talking about. If you're going to be planning self disclosure in between sessions, so maybe you realize there's this client, I built up this rapport. I think it'd be really helpful for them if I start to disclose some of the similarities that we have. Here are some questions that you can ask yourself as you're doing that preparation between sessions. Is this disclosure grounded in theory? I mentioned 3, 4 theories earlier of how disclosure is grounded in some of those theories and what the benefits are. Another question would be, is there any other way to keep the locus of the experience within the client's world? So, how can we just focus on their experiences, what's going on in their world, rather than sharing our self disclosure? And I've got some phrases that you can use to do that. So maybe you want to share about yourself, but you realize that's probably not appropriate. You can adjust that a little bit to make it more appropriate. And of course, how will the disclosure affect the therapeutic relationship? If you have a client who came to you and said, look, self disclosure is not helpful for me, then that is going to be it's not going to help the therapeutic relationship. That's the answer to that question. If you had a client who wanted more self disclosure from their therapist in the past, there's the potential for that disclosure to positively affect the therapeutic relationship. And that's why it is so client specific. Each client, you're going to have a different rapport built up with them. They're going to have different experiences that you may or may not be able to relate to. So the key there is for this specific therapeutic relationship, how will the disclosure help or not help? And then if you're preparing in between sessions, think about how and when you want to do the self disclosure. So maybe you've been talking about anxiety for a while, been using that as an example. You've been talking about anxiety for a while and you've thought about this really great self-disclosure that you could share with them related to anxiety, but the next session they don't bring anxiety up at all. Maybe that is a hint to not bring up the self-disclosure because it's not relevant in that session or at that moment for the client. So also prepare for over time if you are how and when you want to share that. When would you know that the clients may be ready or wanting that self disclosure? And then how do you want to make that self disclosure? Of course, make sure there's sufficient client rapport built up before disclosing too much or maybe focusing too much on yourself, but that's going to be so client specific. I think there is an opportunity, especially if we think about cultural differences between us and clients, that if a client maybe makes an incorrect assumption about us or they're talking about stereotypes, that we could address, those might be opportunities to disclose if it feels right for us, it feels right for the client. Um, I don't think that that would be necessarily one where it's like, don't disclose at all. I mean, if they're making incorrect assumptions and it can be helpful to correct those assumptions, just figure out how to do that in a really kind and gentle way. So, disclosure can be used to normalize clients' experiences. It can also be used to model a concept for a client. And here's some examples that I thought of: making mistakes and accepting them. Maybe those shared experiences like anxiety, if you have a very specific, brief story that you could share, reinforcing some of the principles in therapy and how they would apply them in the real world, communicating understanding and acceptance, as well as promoting deeper reflection. And I think if you use self disclosure in the right way, clients might respond with something along the lines of, "Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way," or "Yeah, I could see where you experienced this, and that's similar to what I experience." And that leads them into a deeper reflection, especially for clients who maybe feel alone in their experience. I think that normalization is really important. I found that in especially grief work, being able to normalize that experience can be very helpful. In general, though, I think we do need to recognize that we don't truly know how the client feels. Even if we've had very similar experiences, we don't know exactly how they feel. And I think that is totally okay to share with them. Yeah, I went through something similar, but there's no way that I could understand completely how you feel, and just letting them know that. One of the contributors to that article noted that we should share scars instead of wounds. So essentially, if there's a hurt we have that we haven't healed or addressed yet, that might not be the best disclosure to use in a session. So just being aware of how much of the work have we done around what we're looking to disclose, and whether or not we might be ready to disclose those things. What if you don't want to use self-disclosure? This is just not something that sits with you. Maybe you have clients who don't want you to use self-disclosure. What could you do? I think you could again use whatever the example is, but maybe not note that it was your example or that you experienced it. So some of the phrases I've used are like, when others experience panic attacks, they may feel like they're losing control. Have you ever felt like that? So it's, yeah, maybe I've had a panic attack and I felt like I was losing control, but in this instance I'm saying others generally. So other people experience panic attacks. You could also note, I've had clients, friends, and family who've had a major loss like that. I imagine that it could feel like the world is ending. So, again, maybe you've had a very similar loss that you're going through, or that you've already had compared to what they're going through in their grief, and you don't necessarily want to share that loss with them. So, you could just note that you've had other clients, friends, family who have had a loss similar. Especially if that's your area of specialization, I think that makes even more sense. This person sought you out because you specialize in this. So you've probably done a lot of research, training, you've had a lot of client experience with that particular issue, whatever it might be. So interested to hear what y'all think about self-disclosure. If you feel comfortable, you can put it in the chat. You can also email us. I'll put that in the chat as well. Um, yeah, what questions do you have, concerns about self-disclosure that maybe I could address before we head out? Take your time. I know you have to be subscribed to put in a chat. That's just to cut down on bots and things taking over. So you can always email it. I've got it pulled up here. I can read it. Um, yeah. Oh, I'm glad that it was helpful. Absolutely. I think I came from a peer support specialist background, And self disclosure was one of the top tools that we used. So I've been constantly working since then to figure out how do I incorporate that into my therapy, making the client the focus, right? Like, how is it helpful to them without sharing too much about myself that maybe it would derail the conversation or the focus. Absolutely. I'll hang around. I know the chat can be delayed or you need a minute to think about it. Um, Yeah, great point. So, our disclosures are not protected by the same confidentiality that clients' disclosures are, right? So, we are holding clients' disclosures in strict confidence per our license, per our code of ethics, all the laws that we are held to. Absolutely. Our confidentiality, though, is not on the same level. Whatever we might share with clients, they may share with someone else. I'm sure you've had times where clients have come back and said like, "Oh, I shared what Dana said or I shared what you said with my friends or whatever." Um so that can happen, right? Like if you're sharing something with clients, just know that they're not held to the same confidentiality that we are. That's a really great point. Thanks for sharing that. Somebody else mentioned that when a client might not fully understand a certain idea, maybe they don't know how to apply it to themselves and their life, that self disclosure can help to give them a practical example of what that can look like. Absolutely. Again, I think especially for clients who have not been in therapy before, they may not totally understand like how to apply the information outside of session. So if we can share that with them, some of those practical examples exactly of how they can apply that outside of session. Yeah. Great thoughts, y'all. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we often shy away from self disclosure in our field. Maybe we've been advised to do that. And it really feels like it comes back to Freud and saying that we shouldn't let clients in to our experiences or what we have going on. It'll take away from them. And maybe that is true in some instances of self disclosure. Absolutely. It can pull the focus away from the client and it might be harmful. However, as we see in the research that's been done over the last decade or more, that there are lots of benefits to self disclosure if used in the right way. So I hope that you're not as afraid to use it. um, if you haven't used it before or aren't as comfortable, maybe this will be a good starting place to think about how you might want to use self disclosure. I know there was one code that they had mentioned that didn't really make sense to me as far as related to self disclosure, but I'm sure there's plenty that I didn't talk about that could still be used related to self disclosure. So don't let this be a stopping place. Let it be a starting place for you to figure out how to ethically use self disclosure. I really appreciate y'all being here. You're welcome to head out whenever you're ready, but I'll hang around for a couple more minutes in case there are last questions or thoughts. And this will be available later on demand. So if you missed any of it or want to go back to it, this will be available. Yeah, thank y'all. Have a good day. Of course, I'll put the resources in the description as well. So if you come back and you're looking for those articles, they'll be in the description. All right, y'all. We will wrap up. Have a great rest of your week and hope to see you again in the next one. Thanks. Bye.